Montana Territory. August 1886. Will Harding had knocked on a great many doors in his 28 years. He had knocked on ranch doors and cabin doors and the doors of line shacks at hours when decent people were not answering them. He had been turned away more times than he could count and hired often enough to keep moving, which is a different thing from being wanted. He had spent his entire life working other men's land, fixing other men's fences, mending other men's roofs, sleeping in other men's barns and eating at the far end of other men's tables. Always useful. Never belonging. He was a big man, and a hard one to look at without forming an opinion. Long dark hair down past his collar, tied back off his neck with a strip of rawhide. A thick dark beard he trimmed when he thought of it, which was not often. Hide and wool and worn leather, all of it patched, all of it holding. A face burned brown by 20 summers of working outdoors and cut by the wind of as many winters. He had come down out of high country the way mountain men do, which is quietly, on a good horse, with everything he owned in a single roll behind his saddle. He had ridden 3 days from Miles City on word of a cattle outfit up under the divide that was short-handed. The directions had been vague, the way directions always are. Follow the creek north, look for the red barn. But the barn was where it was supposed to be. And the house beside it was solid, squared log and well kept, with a stone chimney and a straight roof line. The corrals were square and true. The whole place had the look of a property that had been loved, and that was, at this present moment, being held together by somebody who had flatly refused to let it fall. Will Harding sat his horse at the gate a moment and looked at all of that. Then he tied up and walked to the porch and knocked. "Stay by the fire with us tonight, friend, and see this one through to the end. And tell us in the comments where in the world you are listening from, so we can see how far this story travels." The woman who opened that door was not what he expected. She was 26 years old. Dark hair pinned up off her neck. Dark eyes that took the entire situation in and finished assessing it before she had committed to a single word. She wore a blue work dress with flower on one sleeve, and she was holding a ledger book, which she did not set down when she opened the door, and which Will Harding would think about for the rest of his life. She looked at him the way you look at a fence before deciding whether to fix it or tear it out and start over. He took his hat off. "Ma'am," he said, "I heard you might be needing a hand. I'm a good worker. I've got experience with cattle. I can ride, I can shoe, I can build, and I need a husband more than I need a cowhand," she said. Not unkindly. Not cruelly. Just directly, in the manner of a woman stating a fact she had arrived at through arithmetic rather than through sentiment. Will Harding stood on that porch with his hat in his hands and his prepared speech evaporating out of his head like water off a hot stove. She looked at him with those dark eyes a moment longer. "Come in," she said. "I'll explain." And she turned and walked back into her own kitchen, still holding the ledger, and left the door standing open behind her. Will stood on the porch for a good 5 seconds. Then he went in. Because what else is a man going to do when a woman like that opens a door? Her name was May Calloway. Her husband Daniel had died 8 months back of a fever that came on quick and went through him quicker, and he had left her with 300 acres of good mountain grass, 60 head of cattle, 2 horses, and a debt of $420 to the Mill Haven Savings Bank. Daniel had borrowed that money the previous spring to expand the herd. He had been convinced, the way men are convinced, that beef prices were going to rise. They had risen. They had simply not risen fast enough. And then he had died, which no arithmetic accounts for. She laid all of this out at the kitchen table with the ledger open in front of her and a cup of coffee going cold at her elbow, in the flat, exact, unsentimental voice of a woman who had done this accounting many times over and had arrived at the same answer on every single occasion. And then she told him the part he had not known. "Under the law," she said, "a widow in the months after her husband's death is in a hole she cannot climb out of on her own. The estate's in probate. My name isn't clean on the title yet, and the bank can call the note rather than write new terms for a woman alone. She turned a page without looking at it. Mr. Briggs at the bank has made it fairly clear that he intends to do exactly that. Because he's cruel? Will said. Because the law allows it, May Calloway said. And he answers to his depositors, not to me. She closed the ledger and put her hands flat on the cover. Without refinancing, the note comes due in 60 days. Will turned his hat slowly in his hands. I have gone through every other door, she said, and they are all locked. Sell cattle. At current prices, I'd have to move 40 head to cover it, and that leaves me nothing to run on through the winter, which means I lose the place next year instead of this one. Borrow from family. I don't have any family. Fight the bank in court. The lawyer in Millhaven told me kindly that I would lose, and he was right. And he did not charge me for the visit. She looked up. What I need, she said, is a husband's signature on the refinancing documents. That is all the law requires. Not a husband's judgment, not a husband's opinion, a husband's signature. Will looked at the ledger. Then he looked at her. You're proposing a business arrangement, he said. I'm proposing a marriage that begins as one, she said. She did not blink when she said it. He would remember that too. You would have a home, she said. $40 a month once the debt is refinanced. And a share of the operation written down in terms so that neither of us has to guess. In return, I need your name on the bank documents, and I need your actual work on this property. Real work. I have a great deal of it, and I am running out of daylight. Will Harding sat in a stranger's kitchen and did not say anything for a while. You don't know me, he said at last. No, she agreed. She picked up her coffee, found it cold, and set it down again. But I know 3 things, she said. You came here looking for honest work. You took your hat off when I opened the door. And you did not laugh when I explained the situation. She met his eyes. That is more than I can say for the last 2 men I asked. Will went very still. There were others. 2. What happened? May Calloway looked at the window for a moment. The first one laughed, she said. He laughed for quite a while, actually. He is a decent enough man, and I do not think he understood what he was doing. He told the story in town afterward. She turned her head back. The second one, she said, attempted to renegotiate the terms in a direction I found unacceptable. She said it exactly like that. Flat, even, the way a person says a thing they have decided in advance they are not going to be shaken by. And Will Harding, who had spent his whole life among men and knew precisely what that sentence meant, felt something go cold and quiet all the way down the middle of him. Where is he now? Will said. It did not come out as a question. May looked at him with new attention. He is in Millhaven, she said, and he does not come out here any more. I made that clear at the time. With a scattergun. There was a pause. All right, Will said. You have until tomorrow morning to decide, she said, standing up and gathering the ledger against her hip. The barn's clean and dry. There's food in the kitchen, and you're welcome to it. If your answer is no, I'd take it as a kindness if you'd say so and ride out early, because I have got 60 days, and I cannot spend one of them being disappointed. And she went back to her accounting. Will sat at that table a long time. Then he took his hat and went out into the blue evening to see to his horse, and as he crossed the yard he stopped. Because across the east pasture, up on the long ridge line where the timber started, a man sat a horse and did not move. Just sat there, watching the house. Will stood in the yard and watched him back. The rider turned his horse and went east into the timber before Will could get any kind of look at him. Will filed that away, the way a man files away a hairline crack in a beam, and he went to the barn. He slept in the hay that night. It was a good barn, dry, tight, no daylight through the roof. The animals in it were settled and healthy, and their feet were in good order, and Will Harding knew, because he had seen a great many barns, that a neglected place shows in its animals before it shows anywhere else. These animals were not neglected. He lay on his back in the hay with his hands behind his head and listened to a horse shift its weight in the dark, and he thought about a widow with a ledger and a debt of $420 and a rider sitting motionless on a ridge. And he thought about his own life. He had spent all of it moving. He had moved because nothing had ever given him a reason not to, and because moving is easier than the alternative, and because a man who does not stay anywhere cannot be thrown out of anywhere. There had been a farm in Missouri once, 40 acres of poor ground and a house that leaked, and a father named Amos Harding, who had been a decent man for about 6 years of Will's childhood and then had stopped being one, the way men do when the drink gets into the seams of them and starts working the boards apart from the inside. There had been a mother, too, who did not last. She died when Will was 11, and it was never clear to him, then or afterward, whether it was the fever that killed her or simply the accumulated weight of the life. And there had been a night when Will was 15 years old and had come in from the field and found his father standing over the wood stove with his hand raised to a younger boy. And Will Harding had crossed that kitchen and put his father down on the floor with one blow, and then stood there, shaking, looking at what he had done, at his own father lying on the boards. And then he had walked out the door. He had not taken anything with him. He had walked out into the dark in his working clothes, and he had kept walking, and he had gone west, and he had never gone back. He had written to him twice in 13 years. Neither letter had been answered. He had not written again in 3 years. And in all that time he had worked for men who owned things. He had gone back at night to bunkhouses and haylofts and other men's spare rooms. And he had lain awake in the particular quiet that hangs over land that belongs to somebody else. And he had wondered, in a way he had never once said out loud to another living soul, what it would feel like to drive a nail into something that was his. He had always believed the echo would sound different. He came to the kitchen at 6 in the morning. May Calloway was already up, coffee made, bacon in the pan, the ledger open on the table beside her plate, because of course it was. She looked up. Yes, Will said. She looked at him for a moment, and something moved in her face. It was not relief, exactly. It was the controlled exhale of a person who has been holding up a very heavy thing all by herself for a very long time, and has just felt a second pair of hands come under it. "Sit down," she said. "Eat. We'll go to town this afternoon." They were married at 3 o'clock on a Wednesday in the parlor of the Reverend's house in Mill Haven, with 2 witnesses who were the Reverend's wife and a man they found sweeping the porch. May wore her good dress, which was gray. Will wore his clean shirt, which he had washed in the creek that morning and dried on a fence rail. The ceremony took 11 minutes. Walking back to the wagon afterward, May said, "Thank you." And Will said, "We ought to go over the cattle records tonight. I want to know what we're working with before the week's out." She looked at him sideways. "All right," she said. And for the first time since he had knocked on her door, the possibility of a smile went across May Calloway's face. It did not entirely arrive. But it was there, and Will Harding saw it. And he thought about it for the rest of the afternoon. What was also there, on the road back through Mill Haven, was a man standing outside the feed store watching their wagon go past. He was big and rough and bearded in a good heavy coat, and he had the stillness of a man who has just learned something and is standing very quietly while he decides what he intends to do about it. "Who's that?" Will said, not turning his head. "Garrett Holland," May said. "He runs the outfit east of us. He has been trying to buy this place since the week Daniel died." "He offer fair?" "He offered $11 an acre," she said, "for land worth 30. Twice, and the second time he mentioned, in a friendly way, that a woman alone in this country is taking a considerable risk." Will Harding kept his eyes on the road. He had fixed enough broken things in his life to recognize the particular kind of damage that begins with a man watching from a distance. The first weeks were entirely practical. Will worked from before sunup to after dark. The cattle first, then the fences, then the barn roof, which was going soft on the east side where the weather came from, and which would not have lasted another winter. He asked questions constantly. Not the sort of questions a man asks to show a woman that he knows things, but the sort a man asks when he is genuinely trying to understand a system he intends to be responsible for. Where does the water stand in spring? Which drawer drifts full first? What did Daniel do about the north gate? Why is that pasture rested? And May answered him with the crisp efficiency of a woman who had been explaining this land to herself, out loud, alone, every single day for 8 months, simply to keep herself upright. He had worked for other men his whole life, and the work had always felt borrowed. Somebody else's problem, solved. Somebody else's profit, made. You did the job right because doing it wrong was beneath you, and then you rode away and it belonged to somebody else, and always had. The day he drove the first nail into that barn roof, he stopped. He sat back on his heels on the pitch of the roof with the hammer in his hand and the whole enormous country spread out under him. The grass going gold, the peaks standing white at the far end of it, and he listened to the sound the nail had made going in. The echo was different. He sat there about half a minute. Then he went back to work. The bank meeting happened on the Thursday. Harlan Briggs was a small, precise, carefully dressed man with the settled expression of somebody who considered himself entirely reasonable and was, on a fair number of occasions, not. He reviewed the paperwork. Then he asked Will 3 questions about the property. He did not look at May while he asked them. Will answered all 3 from memory, without checking, because he had walked every foot of that ground in 11 days and had asked more questions than most men ask in a year. Briggs signed the refinancing. Walking out into the street afterward, May said, "He looked at you like you had done something remarkable." "What did I do?" "You answered his questions about my land," she said, without turning to me first. She said it evenly, looking straight ahead. "He has known me since I was 19 years old," she said. "He has been in my kitchen. He drank my coffee at Daniel's funeral. And he has never once, in 8 months, asked me a question about my own property." Will did not say anything. He climbed up onto the wagon seat and picked up the lines and looked down the street at Millhaven, Montana, and he found that he had formed a considerable number of opinions in a very short time. They rode about 2 miles before she spoke again. "Daniel was a good man," May said to the road ahead of them. "I want you to know that, because you are going to be living in his house and sleeping under his roof, and I will not have you thinking I am glad he is gone. I didn't think that. He was kind, and he was funny, and he worked himself half to death for this place." She held her hands still in her lap. "And he made one bad decision in the spring of '85. Which was to borrow $420 against a rise in beef prices that every man in this territory swore was coming. And then he caught a fever in December, and he was dead in 9 days. She was quiet a moment. "He asked me to forgive him," she said. "At the end. He knew what he'd left me in. He lay in that bed, and he asked me to forgive him for the note. And I told him there was nothing to forgive, and that was the last conversation I ever had with my husband." Will did not say anything, because there was nothing to say that would not have been an insult. "He is buried on the rise behind the house," May said. "I would like you to know where, so you don't put a fence through him." "I'll go and look tomorrow," Will said. May Calloway nodded once and did not speak again the rest of the way home, and Will Harding understood that he had just been handed something very large and very carefully wrapped, and that the correct thing to do with it was to carry it without comment. He went up the rise behind the house the next morning, the way he had said he would. The grave was well kept. Somebody had been up there. There was a cedar marker with the name cut into it by hand, and the letters were not straight, and Will Harding stood there a while and understood that she had cut them herself, because there had been no money for a stone and no man to do it for her. He crouched down and pulled a little grass back from the base of the marker. He did not know what to say to a dead man whose house he was living in and whose wife he had married on a Wednesday afternoon in 11 minutes. So he said what was true. "I'm going to keep it," he said. "The place. I don't know yet whether I'm any good to her, but I'll keep the place, and I'll keep her, and nobody is going to take it off her while I'm standing on it." He straightened up. "That's all I've got," he said. And he went back down the hill and got to work on the barn roof, and he never told her that he had gone up there, and she never asked, and he found, some weeks later, that somebody had left a small bunch of late asters at the base of that marker, and it had not been him. The town talked, of course. A mountain town runs on gossip the way a mill runs on water, and there was not a soul in Mill Haven who did not have a view on the matter within a week. She had married a drifter. That was the shape of it. A saddle tramp who had come down off the divide with everything he owned tied behind him, and inside of one day the Calloway place had a new name on the banknote. He was after the land. That was the popular one. And there was another one, said more quietly, mostly by men, and it had a laugh in it, and it was that a widow who cannot hold a ranch will take whatever walks up the road. Will heard it twice. The first time he let it go. The second time was in the feed store, from a man named Pratt who worked for Garrett Holland, and Will Harding set down the sack he was carrying and crossed the room and stood in front of him and did not raise his voice at all. "Say the rest of it," he said. Pratt did not say the rest of it. Will picked up his sack and paid for his goods and walked out, and it was not spoken in front of him again. Though of course it went on being spoken. May found out about it 4 days later, the way women find out about everything. She did not thank him. She looked at him across the supper table for a moment with those assessing dark eyes, and then she said, "You didn't hit him." "No, why not?" Will thought about it. "Because then the story would be about me hitting him," he said, "instead of about him being wrong." May Calloway put down her fork. "Yes," she said. "That's right." And she went back to her supper, and Will went back to his, and something in that kitchen was different afterward, and neither of them said one word about it. The trouble with the East pasture started in September. It started small, the way these things do. A section of the boundary fence was down one morning, 3 posts pulled clean, wire coiled back neatly, which is not how cattle do it, and not how weather does it either. Will rebuilt it. 2 weeks later it was down again, 40 yards further west than it had been, and when he went to reset it, he found that the survey stakes marking the property line had been pulled and driven again 80 feet inside Calloway ground. He stood out there a long while looking at those stakes. Then he went back to the house and asked May for the deed. She brought it. She brought the original survey with it, and the plat, and the tax receipts, and she laid all of it on the kitchen table in order, because May Calloway did not lose paper. "He's moving the line," Will said. "He is." "You knew?" "I suspected," she said. "I could not prove it, and I could not have done anything about it if I had. A widow accusing Garrett Holland of moving a boundary stake in this county is a woman making herself ridiculous." Will looked at the deed. "You are not a widow anymore," he said. He rode into Mill Haven the next morning and hired the county surveyor, and paid him $12 out of his own first month's wages, and brought him out, and had the entire east line resurveyed and the corners set in stone and the whole thing filed at the county seat. It took 9 days, and it cost more than they could comfortably spend. May watched him do it and said nothing until it was done and the filed copy was on the kitchen table. Then she said, "That was your wages." It was. "Will," he looked up. "That's the first time you've used my name," he said. May Calloway opened her mouth and closed it, and picked up the survey and read it very carefully for a considerable length of time, and did not look at him at all. Garrett Holland came in October. He rode into the yard with 2 men behind him and did not get down, which told Will everything he needed to know about how the conversation was going to go. He was a big man. Rough, weathered, bearded, a mountain rancher himself, and not some soft creature out of a town. Whatever else he was not a coward, and he was not a fool. And Will took his measure and revised 1 or 2 things. "Harding," Holland said. "Mr. Holland, you had my east line resurveyed." "I had the Calloway line resurveyed," Will said. "It came out where the original survey put it in 79. If that's inconvenient for you, I'd take it up with the county." Holland looked at the house. He looked at the barn, which had a new roof on the east side. He looked at May Calloway standing on her own porch with her arms folded. "That's good grass," he said. "It is. It's better grass than she can run." Holland turned back. 60 head on 300 acres. That's a hobby. I've got 1,100 head and I'm short of summer range, and there is a fact of arithmetic in that, whether anybody likes it or not. There is, Will agreed. And there's another fact of arithmetic, which is that it isn't yours. The two men behind Holland shifted in their saddles. Holland looked at Will Harding a long moment. "You've been here 9 weeks, he said. "That's so. 9 weeks ago you were nobody, riding a horse down a road." "That's so too," Will said. He did not move. He did not raise his voice. He stood in that yard with his hands loose at his sides and looked up at a man on a horse and did not give him 1 single inch of ground. "And now I'm here," he said. Garrett Holland turned his horse and rode east and did not say goodbye. They cut the fence on the 4th of November, at night. Not the east line, which was surveyed and filed and would have been foolish. They cut the north wire, where the Calloway cattle wintered close to the creek, and they cut it in 3 places, and they left the gates open behind them, and it was done sometime between midnight and 3 in the morning by men who knew exactly what they were doing. Cattle drift with weather. It is the most reliable thing about them, and the weather that night was a hard north wind coming down off the divide with the first real bite of winter in it. And by dawn 41 head of Calloway cattle had drifted 11 miles south into broken country, and scattered into every coulee and draw between the ranch and the mussel shell. Will was in the saddle before the light. He was in the saddle for 5 days. That country south of the ranch is broken. It is coulee and cutbank and blind draw, cottonwood bottoms and sagebrush benches, and a cow that goes into it does not stay in one place, and 41 of them scattered across 11 miles of it is not a gather, it is a search. He rode out at dark, and he came back at dark. He ate, standing up. When he ate, he slept perhaps 4 hours a night in a bedroll under a cutbank with his saddle for a pillow and his horse picketed 6 feet away. Because riding home would have cost him a working day, and he did not have a working day to spend. He hired nobody. There was nobody in that country to hire who did not, in one way or another, draw wages from Garrett Holland. On the first day, he found 9 head. On the second, he found 6, and lost most of the afternoon to a bog at the head of a draw, where a heavy cow had gone down to her belly in half-frozen mud, and he spent 3 hours getting her out with a rope and a horse and the flat of his own shoulder, and when she finally came free, she got up and tried to kill him, which is exactly what a cow does after you save her life. On the 3rd day, May rode out and found him. He looked up from a coulee bottom at mid-morning, and she was sitting her horse on the rim above him with a bedroll behind her saddle and a rifle in a scabbard under her knee, and she did not ask his permission, and she did not apologize. "Take the eastern draws," she said. "I know the western side better. I've been riding it since I was 19, and she was gone before he could argue. She could ride. He had not known that about her. She rode like a woman who had been born on a horse and had simply been too busy for 8 months to remember that she was one. She took the western coolies alone for 3 days, and she brought back 9 head by herself on the 4th, driving them up out of a cottonwood bottom in the last hour of light. And she did not mention it, then or ever. They got back 38 of the 41. 3 they did not find. They rode for those 3 on the 5th day until the light was entirely gone, and they never did find them, and they never learned what became of them. 3 head. In the arithmetic of that ranch, in that year, 3 head was the entire difference between a good year and a hard one. Both of them knew it. Neither of them said it. On the 5th night, Will came in at 9 o'clock, so tired he had to hold the doorframe, and May Calloway put a plate in front of him and sat down across the table and looked at him. "Say it," he said. "You could leave," she said. Will lifted his head. "The terms are 4 months, May said. You signed for 4 months. You have got 2.5 months left on that paper, and there is nothing in it that says you have to freeze to death in a coulee for cattle that are not legally yours until the estate clears probate. She was very calm about it. She was always very calm about the things that mattered most. I want you to understand that I know that, she said. That's all. I want it said out loud, once, so that whatever you decide it knowing that I know. Will Harding looked at his plate for a while. When I was 15, he said, I walked out of a house in Missouri in the middle of the night, and I have been walking out ever since. 13 years. I have never once stayed anywhere past the point where staying cost me something. He looked up. I've been thinking about that for 5 days out in that country, he said. And what I have arrived at is that I don't want to be a man who does that anymore. He pushed the plate an inch away from him. So no, he said. I'm not going anywhere. And on the subject of Garrett Holland, I'd ask you to leave that to me. May Calloway sat very still. Then she got up and refilled his coffee, which she had never once done, and she put her hand flat on the table beside his for about 2 seconds, and then she took it back and sat down. It was the first time either of them had touched the other since the 11-minute wedding. There is a thing that happens between two people who work. It does not happen over dinners or across parlors or through any of the usual polite machinery. It happens over 1,100 pounds of wet hay. It happens at the far end of a 2-man saw. It happens when a cow goes down in a bog hole and the two of you are shoulder to shoulder in the mud at 40 degrees, and you find out, without ever discussing it, exactly what the other person is made of. By the end of October, Will Harding and May Calloway had learned each other the way two people learn a piece of ground. He learned that she was not cold. That had been his first reading of her, and it had been entirely wrong. She was armored, which is not the same thing at all, and there is a difference between a woman who feels nothing and a woman who has been holding herself together with both hands for 8 months and cannot afford to set anything down. He learned that she sang, very quietly, almost under her breath, when she thought she was alone in the barn. He learned that she read every night, and that she had 11 books, and that 6 of them were about cattle, and 3 of them were about law. And May Calloway learned some things too. She learned that this enormous rough-handed drifter with the wild hair and the beard was, of all the unlikely things, gentle with animals, not soft. Gentle. She watched him with a spooked 2-year-old for the better part of a morning, and he never once raised his voice or his hand, and at the end of it the horse was following him around the corral like a dog. She learned that he could not read very well. That took her some weeks to understand, because he hid it, and hid it skillfully, the way a man hides a thing he has been shamed for. He could read enough to get by. He could not read a contract. She did not say anything about it for a long time. Then, one evening in October, she simply sat down beside him at the table with the ledger and started reading the entries out loud as she wrote them. Every night, without comment, without explanation, without ever once making it a lesson. And after about 3 weeks, Will Harding began to read them back to her. Neither of them ever spoke about that either. It was not a thing that needed speaking about. It was simply a thing that got done, in a kitchen, in the evenings, in the last weeks before the sky came down. And then came the winter. They called it the Big Die-Up. 1886 into 1887. It is the winter that broke the open range forever, that finished off the great cattle empires, that killed men and animals across 4 territories and left a country full of ranchers who never got up again. It came early. It came hard. It did not let go until April. The first blizzard hit in the 2nd week of November and put 4 feet on the level. The second came 10 days later. By the middle of December, the drifts along the north fence were over a man's head, and the creek was frozen to the bottom, and the cattle were standing in the timber not moving, because moving costs an animal heat, and by December an animal in that country had no heat to spend. And it got cold. 22 below at the barn thermometer on the 3rd of January. It stayed under 0 for 19 straight days. Will Harding worked that winter the way a man works when the alternative is that everything ends. He broke ice on the creek twice a day with an axe, and the ice was 14 inches, and it healed over behind him. He hauled hay out to the timber on a sledge because a wagon could not move. He hauled it out to them because they would not come into it, and that was the part that killed most of the herds in Montana that winter, the animals simply stopping, standing where they stood, going down where they stood. He lost feeling in 3 fingers of his left hand in January, and it never fully came back. May worked beside him. She thawed hay. She fed. She got up at 2 a.m. to feed the fire, and she went out with him in the dark, and neither of them ever once discussed whether she would, because there was nothing to discuss. They cut the hay ration in half in January, and in half again in February, because it was going to run out, and they both knew what the ledger said, and the ledger was the only thing in that house that did not lie. They lost cattle. Everybody lost cattle. Garrett Holland, with his 1,100 head, lost 740 of them and never recovered. Outfits all over that country lost 60%. 70, 90, there were men that spring who rode out and found their entire life's work standing dead in the willows. The Calloway place went into that winter with 58 head after the drift. It came out in April with 53. 5 head. 5 head lost in the worst winter in the recorded history of the Northern Range. There is no explanation for that except 2 people who did not sleep. And there were the calves. They came in the last week of February, which was too early, which is what happens when a bull gets into a pasture in May that he had no business being in, and one of them arrived on the coldest night of the entire winter with the wind screaming out of the north. 3 calves, all 3 of them born wet into 20 below air, which kills a calf in under an hour. Will carried them into the kitchen. He carried them in one at a time through the drifts, and May had already pulled the table back and laid down blankets by the stove before he was through the door with the first one. And the 2 of them worked over those 3 animals for the better part of 6 hours. Rubbing them down with sacking, warming milk, wrapping them, getting them up onto their feet and holding them there when they went down. There is not much dignity in it. It is wet, and it is filthy, and it is exhausting, and there is a particular smell to a newborn calf drying out beside a hot stove that Will Harding never forgot as long as he lived. At 4 a.m, the smallest one, a little bull calf, stopped shivering. That is bad. Shivering is a body fighting. When they stop, they are done. May was on the floor with her back against the wood box and that calf across her lap in a blanket, and she was so tired her hands were not working right. And Will knelt down beside her and put his hands over hers, and the 2 of them rubbed that animal's chest together for 20 minutes without saying one word. And it lived. It shuddered, and it kicked, and it got its head up and made a noise like a rusty gate, and May Calloway laughed. She laughed out loud, once, a startled, cracked, exhausted laugh, at 4 a.m. on a kitchen floor covered in filth at 22 below zero. And Will Harding looked at her and understood, with a completeness that took the breath clean out of him, that he was going to love this woman for the rest of his natural life, and that it had probably happened somewhere around the 2nd time she picked up that ledger. He did not say it. It was not the moment, and he was not the man. He said, "That's all 3. And May said yes, and they sat on the kitchen floor with their backs against the wood box and 3 calves breathing in blankets beside the stove, and neither of them moved for an hour, and the winter went on screaming outside, and it did not get in. Spring came late and ugly, the way it does after a winter like that. The snow went off in April, and it took the whole story with it. The country was full of dead cattle. The creeks ran foul with them. Men rode out and counted and rode back and did not speak. Will rode the east fence line on the first warm day in April, and Garrett Holland was sitting his horse on the far side of it. He had aged. That was the plain truth. He had gone into the winter a hard, prosperous man with 1,100 head, and he had come out of it with 360 and a face that had learned something it did not enjoy learning. He looked at the corrected boundary stakes, frozen into the ground now, and filed at the county seat, and stone set. He looked at the new wire. He looked at Will. "My men," he said, "that night in November were doing what you told them," Will said, "or what you allowed them to do. It comes out the same." Holland did not deny it. "The survey stands," he said. "It does." "Then there's nothing more to be said about the east pasture." Will Harding set down his fence tool and straightened up and looked at him directly. "There's one thing," he said. Holland waited. "May Calloway has been on this land her whole adult life," Will said. "She came here at 19. She buried her husband on that rise behind the house. She held this place through a bank that wanted it and a winter that damn near took it, and neighbors who looked at a woman on her own and saw an opportunity instead of a person." He picked the tool back up. "She isn't alone anymore," he said. "I'd like the two of us to understand each other on that particular point, and then I'd like us to be neighbors, because I have got 40 miles of fence to fix, and I would rather not fix it twice." Garrett Holland looked at him for a long moment. It was the kind of look that takes a man's full measure and reports back honestly on what it finds. Then he nodded. Once, it was the nod of a man who has decided to be a neighbor instead of a problem, and who has made that decision because somebody finally gave him a real reason to. He turned his horse and rode east. Will watched him go until he was out of sight. Then he went back to the fence, because the fence needed 3 more hours of work. And he was going to be here to finish it. And he was going to be here tomorrow, too, for the first time in 28 years. That was not a compromise. It was exactly what he wanted. The terms had expired in November. Neither of them had mentioned it. They had gone through the big die-up, and the drift, and the calves, and the survey, and 11 miles of broken country, operating on a piece of paper that had run out somewhere in the middle of it, and that nobody had thought about once. On an evening in March, with the fire going, and the accounts closed, and the first real softness in the air after the long cold, Will said the terms. May looked up from her book. "They ran out in November," he said. "We've been going without a contract since before the die-up." "I know," she said. Of course she knew. She was May Calloway. She had probably known to the day. "I'd like to discuss new terms," Will said. May Calloway set her book down. Will looked at the fire for a moment, because he was about to do the hardest thing he had ever done, and he wanted to do it right. Then he looked at her. "I'd like the arrangement to be permanent," he said. She did not move. "Not because of the land," he said. "Not because of the bank, or the probate, or the legal situation, or the $40 a month." He paused. "Which I haven't been taking," he said. May's eyes did not leave his face. "I know," she said. "It's in the February accounts. 5 entries. Return to operation. You never said." "I was waiting," she said, "to see how long it would take you to." Will laughed. It came out of him rough and surprised. "Because of you," he said. "That's the whole of it. Because of you. And because of this." And he gestured at all of it. At the kitchen and the stove and the ledger on the table. At the floor where 3 calves had lain wrapped in blankets on the coldest night of the century. At the coffee that was always on. At an entire life that had been built in 8 months out of pure necessity and had gone on being built long after the necessity ended out of something else altogether. "I'd like it to be a marriage," Will Harding said. "A real one." May Calloway looked at him for a long time. "Will," she said. "Yes, it became a real one somewhere around the calves in the kitchen." He looked at her, and she looked back at him with those dark, direct, assessing eyes. The same eyes that had taken his measure in a doorway in August and had been quietly deciding things about him ever since. Through the bank meeting, and the east fence, and Holland's men in the dark, and 22 degrees below zero, and 3 calves wrapped in blankets beside a stove at 4 in the morning. She stood up from the table. She crossed the 2 feet between them. And she kissed him. Not tentatively. Not as a business arrangement, but with the complete and unhurried conviction of a woman who makes her decisions carefully and then keeps them entirely. And he kissed her back with the certainty of a man who had spent 28 years driving nails into other men's barns, and had finally, at long last, driven one into something that was his. Outside, the Montana spring was coming up over the land that the two of them had decided, together, to keep. The pasture came in strong that year. It does, after a winter like that. The ground gets broken and turned and forced to renew itself, and what comes up out of it afterward is better than what was there before, and there is a lesson in that, if a person cares to take it. Will walked the east line in May with his wife beside him, the two of them checking wire after the thaw, and he looked at that country the way he had been looking at it since August, as something that was his to understand and his to keep. He wrote to his father in April. It was the first letter in 3 years, and it took him 4 evenings, and he tore up 2 of them. What he finally sent said very little. It said that he was in Montana. It said that he had married. It said that the winter had been the worst anybody could remember, and that they had come through it. And it said, "I found a place. I'm staying." May found that letter on the table before he sent it. She read it, because she read everything, and she said nothing at all about it, which was her particular way of saying a great deal. The herd rebuilt. 53 head became 58 by the middle of May with the spring calves, and one of those calves was a stocky little bull with a white face who had been born on the coldest night of 1887 and had spent the first 3 days of his life on a kitchen floor, and who May Calloway Harding refused, absolutely and permanently, to sell. The operation ran at a modest profit that year, not the great expansion Daniel Calloway had borrowed against and died before he could see, but something real, and something sustainable, built on ground that had been tested as hard as ground can be tested, and had held. Harlan Briggs at the bank stopped Will on the street in Mill Haven in April and told him, with the mild surprise of a man revising an expectation he had held for some time, that the Calloway Harding note was the most current account in his entire portfolio. He had turned out to be, as Will had suspected he might, a man trying to do a difficult job inside a legal system that made it hard to be decent, rather than a man who had ever wanted to take a widow's land. He asked after Mrs. Harding, he asked her a question about her own property, and he asked it to her face the next time she came in. May Calloway Harding did not mention it afterward, but she wrote it in the ledger, which is where she put the things that mattered. There was one more morning. It was in May, and Will came in from the east fence and washed at the basin and sat down across the table from his wife, and May pushed the open ledger toward him without a word. He looked at the page. She had turned it to the salary line, $40 a month, 5 months, $200, and beside every single entry, in her careful upright hand, she had written the same 3 words: return to operation. Will looked up. She was looking at him. Not at the book. At him. "You have been paying yourself back into this place," she said. "The operation needed it." "The operation needed it," she agreed. She folded her hands on the table. "So did I," she said. Will did not say anything. "You could have left," May said. "After Holland. After the die-up. After 5 days in that country hunting cattle that were not legally yours. There was a piece of paper in this house that gave you every right to ride out, and nobody in the territory would have thought one word about it." Will Harding looked at the numbers in that book, at the careful accounting of everything the two of them had built and every single thing it had cost them. "No," he said, "I couldn't have." May looked at him a long moment. Then she closed the ledger, and outside, the Montana spring lay over 300 acres of hard-won mountain grass that belonged, completely and without any further argument, to both of them. The east fence was standing. The herd was growing. The survey was filed at the county seat. The debt was on schedule. And Garrett Holland had turned out to be a tolerable neighbor. And inside, the kitchen was warm, and the coffee was on. And it was, by every measure May Calloway had ever used in her life, exactly right. Now think about that door in August, friend. A woman opened it with a ledger in her hand and told a total stranger that she needed a husband more than she needed a cowhand. She had asked twice before. One man laughed at her and told the story in town. The other one tried to turn her desperation into something ugly and had to be run off her own porch with a scattergun. And she asked anyway. That is the thing worth sitting with tonight. Not the winter, though the winter nearly killed them. Not the fence, though the fence nearly cost them everything. The asking. She had every reason on earth to expect to be refused again, and probably humiliated again, and she stood in her own doorway and she asked anyway, because the alternative was losing the only place she had ever belonged to, and she had decided that her pride was worth less to her than her land. That is not weakness. Understand that. There are people who will tell you that a woman who asks like that has been beaten down, and they are wrong, and they have it exactly backward. It takes nothing at all to keep your pride when you have got other options. It takes everything you have got to set it down on the table in front of a stranger when you have got none. May Calloway set hers down twice, and had it handed back to her in pieces both times. And then she opened the door a third time. And on the other side of that door stood a man who had spent his entire life moving. 28 years of driving nails into other men's barns and listening for an echo that always came back sounding the same. He followed a woman he had known for one single day into a kitchen in Montana and said yes to the strangest proposition anybody had ever put to him. And in September, he drove a nail into a barn roof, and he stopped. And he listened. And the echo was different. That is the whole story. A woman who asked for what she needed when she had every reason to expect to be refused. A man who had been looking for a reason to stay, and found one before he even understood that he was looking. Two people who wrote 4 practical terms on a sheet of paper in August, and were still sitting at the same kitchen table in March, not because of the terms, but because of everything that had grown up in between them while the worst winter in the history of the West did its level best to break them. And failed. The greatest thing in this country was never the open road, whatever the songs tell you. It was always the moment when somebody finally decided to stop, and stay, and build something. May asked. Will followed her inside, and the rest of it was just the work. And the work, it turned out, was the entire point. That is what she knew, standing in that doorway with her ledger, that most people never learn at all. If this story stayed with you tonight, tell us in the comments. Have you ever had to ask for something when you were certain you would be refused? And where in the world are you listening from? We read every single one of them. And if you love these stories of the men and women who built whole lives out of nothing but hard ground and stubborn hearts up in the high wild country, settle in and stay a while. Like this story, share it with someone who needs to hear it tonight. And subscribe to ride along with us. Because there is a new story waiting by the fire every single week. Thank you for sitting with us. We will see you up the trail.